decided to start a new series on tracking tips. So without further ado, here's tracking tip number 1. How do I handle the situation when I bump a deer that I'm tracking? The very first thing I do is I try to determine whether or not he saw me or smelt me. Because if he only heard me, there's a really good chance that he'll just run a little distance and stop and then watch his backtrack. Several times I've killed the deer that I've jumped by just continuing to move forward and watching really carefully. If the deer in fact continued on and ran out of the area, there's a good chance that he'll run anywhere from a quarter mile to a half mile and maybe even more. After running quite a distance, they usually slow down and will bed up again. That isn't always the case, but usually they will. I think it's really important to give the deer some time to settle down after you bump them. A good amount of time would be anywhere from maybe a half hour to an hour. When I first started tracking and I would bump a deer, I would just stop right where I bumped him, and I would wait about a half hour to an hour before taking the track again. I dress very lightly, so usually I would get cold when I stop and wait. So now, instead of sitting around and waiting for an hour, I usually take up the track right away. I take the track real slow. I move really slow and I take my time. The reason for that is I want to just burn up time, but I like to keep moving. I like to stay warm. I will usually stop and mark on my GPS where I bumped the deer, get a good idea where I'm at, checking my GPS out, and if I'm hungry, I'll have a sandwich or I'll drink a little pop or something. But I like to keep active. I like to keep moving so I don't get cold. My thought process there is the longer the better, but that's going to depend on the time of the day. If you're already mid-afternoon, you don't have a lot of time to play. So I'll shorten that time a little bit just simply because I don't have the time to give. If it's really early morning, I'm more likely to take my time a lot more on that deer. Because in almost every case, he's only going to go half a mile and usually bed up. That's where I really want to take that deer, is the very next time I encounter him. That's, in my opinion, that's the best, because the more times you encounter him, the more wary he gets. When you first take the track, he's going to be making these huge leaps, 15 feet, whatever, and he's running to get out of there. Somewhere along the line, he's going to start slowing down, and pretty soon he'll get to that trot. He'll get to where he's taking 4-foot strides, and at that time, I get a little bit more serious about being very quiet, about moving very slow, keeping my movement to a minimum. When the deer slows down to a walk, then I get really serious. No extra motion whatsoever, no noise whatsoever, no movement whatsoever. And when I say none, I'm talking none. The only thing that moves anymore are my legs to take my steps. And even when I do that, it's a slow, steady motion. There's not take a step and then stop, and take a step and stop. It's a fluid motion of just very slow motion movement forward, each foot. And then I set my foot down on the ground even slowly, and I feel with my foot. I don't want to look down. I just want to feel with my foot to see if there's anything there that I might step on that might, like a branch that I might break, or uneven ground, or whatever the case. And all the while, I'm just ripping the woods apart with my eyes, but my head never moves. It's just my eyes. The only thing on my body that's moving back and forth is my eyes. There's a huge amount of difference between moving very slowly and moving so slow that it's almost hard to detect that you're moving. And I can tell you, it's almost impossible to make yourself move that slow and that steady like that. And it takes skill, and you're going to get cold, and it's going to be tough. And that's part of the reason why I also don't like to wait on the track, because I know down the road I'm probably going to freeze when I get to that point in the track. One thing I want to add at this point is be mindful of the wind direction, because if the wind is blowing from you to the deer and he's been making a steady straight line run away from you in a certain direction, and that direction happens to be downwind of where you are, there's a high likelihood that he already has smelled you, because you're probably within 200 yards of him at this point, and he probably has smelled you, and if he hasn't ran already, he probably will before you get a chance to shoot him. So if the wind is not in my favor, if it's strictly in his benefit, I won't go to that really, really slow creep like that. I will move forward at a slow pace, and I will try my best to pick the woods apart, but I move quite a bit faster, simply because the odds are in my favor that I'm not going to get a shot at that deer at this location. So it's wise for me to keep moving, and if he did in fact blow out, I can start the game over one more time, and hopefully he'll move into a situation where the wind is not in his favor. Some may ask, well, if the wind isn't in your favor, why not circle down around? But circle down and around from where? You really don't know where the deer is at. You don't know if he stopped. You don't know if he bedded. If you circle off to the side and get a couple hundred yards off to the side and you're circling around, how do you know that he hasn't blown out already? How do you know if he hasn't turned in the other direction and now you're going somewhere way far away from him? I've always found it best to stay with the track, and if the wind isn't in my advantage, I just keep moving forward, and hopefully I'll bump him into a scenario where it is in my advantage down the road. But let's say we reach that point where that deer is walking, and the wind is in my favor. I go into that very slow crawl, and even if I have to duck under something, it's very slow motion. What I tend to do is I tend to pick out my path that I want to walk, so I don't have to bend around anything, underneath anything, or I'll just slowly but surely slide sideways to get around an obstacle, and it's deathfully slow. It might take me an hour to go 100 yards, and that would even actually be pretty fast. But you got to remember, he's probably within a couple hundred yards of you at this time, and so you don't have to go very far. The main thing is to just rip that woods apart with your eyes to see if you can pick him out. And if you're really moving that slow and you're keeping your eyes busy, you may catch him before he even moves. You might just pick out his ear. He might flicker his ear, whatever the case may be. You just never know. The very last buck I shot, he actually bedded down and he got back up, and I caught him walking right along, right out in front of me. It was the easiest shooting job I've ever had to do, because he got up and he's just walking across in front of me 70 yards broadside. Now, had I been moving faster, he probably would have caught my motion, and he probably would have blown out, and I may have gotten a running shot at him, but who knows? So just very slow. And what I want to do is I'm actually going to demonstrate on film how slow I walk, just to give people an idea. And again, nothing moves. You don't move your head back and forth. Your eyes move. You don't reach up to scratch your nose if it itches. I always hold my gun in my hand and I keep it right where it's at. I don't swing it back and forth. I don't turn my shoulders, my body, anything. It's just like I'm a statue that's on a, like, pretend you're like a statue that's on a cart and somebody's pulling you along through the woods like that. And like I said, the only thing I move is my legs, just very slowly and back, and take very slow steps and really measure them. And believe me, it's the only method I've ever been able to come up with once you've bumped that deer to get an opportunity at him. I've chased him and chased him and chased him and chased him and chased him, and I've never had any luck killing a deer after the initial bump unless I've used this method. So now I'm going to set up the camera, and I'm just going to just do a very short segment of how slow I actually move, so you kind of get an idea. I'm watching what I'm videoing on my cell phone right here, so because I want to be able to see what I'm doing too, so I won't be looking at the camera. But I just want to point some things out on film. First of all, uh, if I'm walking very slow through the woods, and I'm going to do that right now, if I take my time and I'm walking really slow, and I'm watching myself on the video, there's a couple things that I'm noticing by watching that. First of all, every time I take a step, I'm actually swinging back and forth. So if I'm moving toward the deer, he's going to pick that motion up. Also, here's another thing too. If I start turning my head left and right, looking for the deer, look at look at all the motion that's taking place as a result of that. And also, if I take a step forward and stop, there's that movement and then a stop. Okay, you can pick that out. Let's say I adjust my rim of my hat. Let's say I scratch my face. Whatever, I reach out to grab a branch and move it out of my way. All these things that you're going to see on film here, how much that actually shows up. Now, if there's a deer laying out there somewhere watching, motions like this, they're going to pick that up like crazy, and they're going to see that motion. Even yourself, when you're in the woods and you watch, and there's a bird flies across or something, that motion catches your eye. But now, I'm going to try to demonstrate how I do this, and it's going to be hard to do because I'm going to move so slow. But and you'll notice that when there's no arm movements, I'm not moving the gun around, I'm not moving my head, and I'm not taking big steps, or I'm not doing this stuff. You'll watch. I just kind of just like keep sliding forward, and it makes a big difference. So I'll demonstrate that now. As I'm sliding forward, like right now, I'm actually rubbing my toe on the floor to kind of feel for what's there. And then I just move forward ever so easy, like this steady motion. And as you're watching this, you'll see that my legs are moving and I'm bringing myself forward. But as you're watching the video, there's not a lot of motion anymore to pick up or detect. And this is actually almost faster than I want to do in the woods. Now I'm going out of focus here. I'm going to see if I can zoom back here a little bit. It's as far as I can go. But again, you see that little hand motion, how much that really gets picked up by a deer in the woods. So that's how I do that last couple 100 yards. Once that deer reaches a point where he's not trotting anymore and he goes down to a walk. And also, if he stops or slows down and he goes to a walk, and all of a sudden he starts making sharp turns left or right or whatever, I'm almost going to guarantee you he's bedded right there. So that's a really huge indication to be really ready and don't do any extra movement whatsoever. Again, I'll demonstrate how slow I try to move and how I try to keep my motion to a minimal. I just slide that foot forward. I'm actually moving forward at a fairly good clip when I do this. But when you do this, you just don't get that much movement that's really detectable. This is a lot faster than I would actually do it. And then all the while, I'm looking, I don't know if the camera will pick my eyes up though, I'm looking left, I'm looking right, I'm looking everywhere, and I'm moving so slow that I actually have the time to pick apart the woods. And every foot you move forward, there's a whole new scene that you can see that you couldn't see the 1 foot further back. And it might be that ear that you see or something, whatever, by really watching very closely at this time. You got to think of it end game, and you got to think of it that you're going to shoot that deer, and you got to think in your mind, you have to convince yourself that this deer is really there, that this deer is really 100 yards ahead of you or 200 yards ahead of you. And you have to play the game like he is. And you're not going to win everyone. And you're going to be wrong. And some deer, you bump them later on in the day and they get up and they just never stop moving again. They just take off and they just keep going. But you got to play the odds, you got to play the percentages. Whenever I've tried to go after them and move too fast forward on them, I always continue to keep bumping them because they're watching. They usually button hook and they watch their backtrack, so they're looking for you to come. It just seems something happens when you move that super slow, that for some reason they will check up a little bit longer, or maybe they don't even notice you. Maybe the movement is so minimum they don't actually even notice you coming. It's weird. Even wearing Blaze Orange in the snow, I've came up onto deer, and you're standing there and you think you're in the wide open wearing Blaze Orange, and they look right through you. So if you get on a track, try this method and see what happens. Maybe this one will put a big buck on the wall for you.